So good morning, everybody. We're just seeing the participant numbers ticking up in the bottom corner of my screen. So we're going to get underway because we're joined by a chair of trustees today who I know likes to keep things running to time. So I don't want to offend Grant at all this morning. So thank you very much for joining this cybersecurity webinar. We're really lucky to have with us today some experts in the industry. So I'm going to be your host for today. My name's Ben Goldby. I'm a pensions lawyer, as you can probably see by what I'm wearing and the grey background. I'm joined by my colleague at Gowling WLG, Helen Davenport. Helen is a partner in our disputes team, and she's a cybersecurity and data protection expert with first-hand experience of dealing with cyber attacks. And we're also joined by Grant Suckling from Ross Trustees. Grant has over 20 years of experience in the pensions industry, and he's on the front line in supporting clients with cyber risk management. So you will have a good range of people with pensions backgrounds there, and the expertise from Helen on our disputes side. So the intention of today's session really is to give you as many practical tips as we can on how to address the cyber risk that is facing your pension scheme. It's a risk that's facing all pension schemes, and it's going up risk registers as we speak. So it's on lots of people's agendas. How do we deal with it? And how do we address the practical day-to-day things that we can do as trustees and even as advisors and independent trustees to change behaviour and approach and make sure that we're mitigating this risk? So we're going to start with some background from me on the pensions regulatory landscape. I'm then going to hand over to Helen and Grant, and they're going to look at the 5 key pillars of managing cyber risk that you can see on your slide there. So that's understanding, assessing, control and mitigation, monitoring, and minimising a cyber attack. And then we've left 10 minutes there at the end for questions. If you have any questions during the session, please submit them using the Q&A function in the bottom window there of the Zoom. We're going to endeavour to get to as many of those as we possibly can. If we don't get to your question, we will respond by email. So if you just put your name on your question, we'll have your contact details from your sign up to this webinar. If you'd like to stay anonymous, please just put the word anonymous at the start. And even though we've got your details, we won't read them out when we deal with your question. So as I say, just to start off, just 10 minutes from me with a little bit of help from Grant about the regulatory landscape there. So I'm indebted to my colleague Rosie, who's moving through these slides for me. Thank you very much, Rosie. So why is cybersecurity and cyber risk on our agendas now? Well, first and foremost, we've got the ESOG and the single code of practice. The effective system of governance has been a requirement for UK pension schemes for a while, actually. It's been in place since February of 2019. But most trustees are only starting to focus on this issue now because we've got the regulator's single code of practice that's available in draft, and that effectively puts some meat on the bones of the ESOG requirement that's in the legislation. One of the things that is identified there in the single code is the need to establish controls and identify risks in relation to cybersecurity. And there's a separate module within the draft single code that covers cyber risk. I know that we're all eagerly anticipating the final version of the single code. I think it's unlikely that the cyber requirements are going to go down at all. If anything, they might go up. So the ESOG requires you to adopt a risk management function proportionate to the size, nature, scale, and complexity of your pension scheme. Now, that's obviously helpful if you're a smaller pension scheme, but the larger you are, the more complex you are, the more sophisticated the system that you need to have in place to deal with cyber security. So that's the wider regulatory context. There's 2 more points that I just wanted to draw out on this slide. The first one is really quite a general point about the world that we all live in now. So the exponential increase in home working, the political instability stemming from the war in Ukraine, and the increasing sophistication of the attackers as we all spend more and more of our lives online and dealing with each other through email. And finally, on this slide, you'll be relieved to know that we're not going to be talking too much about pensions dashboards today. That's a topic for another session. But it's important to have in mind that the staging dates are going to come around much sooner than maybe some of us have been thinking, and that most schemes are going to be looking at a compliance project for dashboards in 2024 and 25. The cyber risks involved are significant because what dashboards are going to do is to shine a giant spotlight on the scheme's data. So having in place an effective system for dealing with cybersecurity is an important part of your preparation.
Thanks, Ben. I agree on the increasing threat of cybersecurity. It's something I've been quite concerned about recently, following all the investment collateral calls we've experienced and the sheer volume and last-minute requests to move significant amounts of money around. In terms of where cyber sits on risk registers and how to prioritize it without losing sight of other risks, well, the good news is cyber is and has been on most risk registers for a while now. It typically sits amongst a whole list of risks, and so it can often get lost or be difficult to see the wood through the trees. It's also a bit harder to score and rate and mitigate against, so perhaps it can sometimes get left in that too difficult pile. Some schemes I'm involved with have a top 10 risk summary for their risk registers, which I'd encourage, and it's there I'd expect to see cyber showing and increasing in its red, amber, green status. Particularly as cyber incidents for pension schemes have more than doubled over the last 2 years, and that risk, as Ben says, can only be increasing. Now, across the industry, we're all acutely aware of the number of things to do and comply with for our pension schemes. The ESOG and ORA requirements increase that significantly, which includes the requirement to have a cybersecurity policy. It's important to remain pragmatic and proportionate, my two favourite Ps, as a trustee and advisor for your schemes in terms of the various policies. But one would think or hope that the requirements to have a cyber policy in place and then making it count features higher up the agenda in terms of compliance and importance than perhaps some of the other more operational policies, given the risk and significance that cybersecurity brings. Of course, having a policy in place to meet a requirement is one thing. Knowing what you'll do with it when you need to move quickly, checking it works, and that as a trustee, you're comfortable with the protections and protocols in place is quite another.
Thanks, Grant. It's really helpful to have that frontline experience there, and I know that you're going to be contributing with that throughout. So that's great. Thank you. So moving on to my next slide, just some general points really to keep in mind throughout this session. The first is that we're not just talking about personal data here, and I've used the dreaded four letters there, GDPR, on this slide. We're not just talking about personal data. We're about 4 years on, we're a bit over 4 years on, and it's difficult to think of that, isn't it, with the pandemic we've had in between. But 2018 was our sort of GDPR compliance deadline. And I know most pension schemes went through a really detailed process of assessing technical and organizational measures, particularly with third-party suppliers. But with GDPR, all of the focus, and rightly so, was on personal and sensitive personal data. This cyber risk that we're talking about here is much wider than that. So while data protection legislation only applied to personal and sensitive personal data, the risk of a loss of any sort of data, for example, passwords or PINs, might lead to an attack which targets the assets of the scheme, not just the personal data of members.
And I think, Ben, for me, the key thing here is just, data protection legislation, it's more than a governance issue. Protection against cyber attack is a matter of risk management in a similar way to other types of risk that we run as trustees, investment losses, covenant deterioration. It's right up there. It's not as simple as that tick box exercise I referred to issue a privacy notice, for example. It really does need to be baked into the processes of the trustee board.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Agreed. And my second bullet point goes to a similar point, really, which is that back in 2018, many of your custodians, your investment advisors, those who don't handle your member data, gave quite limited responses to trustee questionnaires about what practices they had in place. A cyber attack can easily affect one of those providers as well, and could have quite a devastating impact on the scheme and lead to loss of assets. And Grant talked a little bit earlier about the volume of collateral calls at the moment. So it's just keeping in mind that cyber risk as a whole scheme problem, not just a member data problem. My third bullet point there is really quite self-explanatory, and I've used a nice sobering statistic on the slides there, but it's just to say that cybersecurity is not an abstract risk. Trustees need to have appropriate safeguards in place, but human error is really the key issue here. So according to the ICO, the most common human error is sending information to the wrong recipient, the wrong email, or the wrong postal address. I think lots of people on this call will have done that at some stage in their life, probably sometimes to quite embarrassing effect, speaking from personal experience. But that is one of the key errors that we need to focus on and try to mitigate against. And that again plays into my final point here on this slide, which is that this is not a techie risk. It's not something that we need to be solely addressing through firewalls, software, and we need to not get lost in the language about this. It's smack bang in the middle of what trustees should be looking at from a risk management perspective.
And Ben, I agree on the human error point. As a chair of trustees, that's where you tend to see the data breaches occur, all the potentials for cybersecurity. And so Helen and I are going to cover that later, but it's not just about training once, it's about a reminder, about simulating those phishing emails to really just keep everyone on their toes, to remember it could be so easily done. And the other point really for me is, how does this relate to protecting the pension scheme's assets and data? Well, it's right in the middle of what we as trustees need to do from a risk management perspective. Complying with regulatory guidance, reviewing contractual protections, drafting or reviewing policies, reporting breaches where they happen or considering whether to report. It's all part of how we can protect our scheme from these risks.
So, totally agree with that, Grant. So I'm just going to briefly set the scene on my final slide here before I hand over to Helen and Grant, just to point out that there is a lot of guidance out there about cybersecurity. There's a lot of engagement in the industry, which is really great to see. What we've drawn together is really our summary of the regulator's cybersecurity guidance, which was first published back in April 2018, but it's been updated. The guidance from PASA, that's the administration organisation, back in November 2020, and the more recent and really helpful guidance from the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association. So we've subdivided it into the areas that you can see there on your slide: understanding what you need to protect, assessing the threat, putting in place those appropriate controls, and controls are built into that idea of the ESOG as part of your single code compliance project, monitoring the threat, and then responding to incidents and minimising the impact. So I'll pass over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Ben. So as Ben says, we're going to talk through each of those pillars with a practical focus. So let's start with that first then. So the importance of understanding the threat to the pension scheme. Now, traditionally, larger organisations, those holding sort of greatest value in terms of assets, have really been the targets for cyber criminals, and that certainly remains the case. But it's important to bear in mind that we've seen cyber criminals look to target a whole range of different sizes of organisations and in very many different sectors. So trustees really need to understand, firstly, well, what makes a pension scheme an attractive target to cyber criminals, and what is it you really need to protect? Well, you've potentially got large amounts of data, valuable assets, and that makes an attractive target. That data or those assets, they're potentially useful to attackers, so they might be able to use personal data in terms of identity theft. They may be looking to attack assets, money to get their hands on, or potentially to hold you to ransom for the assets that you've got. And within any pension scheme, there is often a sort of range of IT systems relied upon. So the sponsor's IT systems may play a part. Third parties may also be part of that sort of IT system or framework as well. And then there's also the personal setup of individuals. So there's a risk of gaps in that landscape which can potentially be exploited. It's also really important that trustees understand the threats or the perceived threats to pension schemes. So is that the unauthorised access to data, which I've already started to talk about in terms of the threat of hacking, or is it internal risks like shared printers or outdated software?
Helen, I'd agree with the point about the large amounts of data. Our pension schemes hold and receive a lot of data, and we're responsible for a large amount of assets. As Ben said earlier, there's never been more data moving around than today, and at speed, which of course brings additional risks and responsibilities and vulnerabilities. We've seen an uptick in online meetings, working from home, and an increased focus on just-in-time decision-making, particularly around investment and moving monies, all contribute to this issue around cyber for all schemes. In terms of the perceived threats, some examples of threats that I've heard about or seen as a professional trustee: emails can be intercepted, email accounts can be compromised, you might get calls from people who may not be who you think they are, You could sometimes get callbacks from investment managers several weeks or several months after you've processed the forms to check the changes. And by then you've moved on. So actually having to go back and check it is who you're expecting to see to, and that those account details match. Same with disinvestment signatures. And the other bits, being aware of signatures are getting more and more out in the public domain. So thinking twice about signatures actually being online in statement of investment principles, governance statements, etc. So maybe a takeaway from today is to publish redacted versions as well as keep the originals on file. And of course, there's a danger here between the distinction, if we're not careful, of well-governed schemes that can and do take on the threat and put mitigation plans in place, compared to those less well-governed schemes that do not do enough to understand the threat.
As we've just touched upon, we've got cyber attacks. They're becoming increasingly more sophisticated, attackers finding more innovative ways to hack into systems. But that being said, as Grant's just touched upon, it's still possible to take on that threat to reduce the risk of a cyber attack. And the next stage is really assessing that risk and deciding what steps you should or you want to take. You should start by conducting a cybersecurity risk assessment to help uncover potential gaps in your security. Now, if you've got an internal IT team you can call upon, then they can help, or you might be able to use the sponsor's IT team, and they can help you with that risk assessment. Alternatively, you may be able to bring in a third-party IT expert to help you. And they'll be able to stress test your systems and tell you where your vulnerabilities are, and you'll want to keep that under review. Now, there's some other important parts in this risk assessment. You want to bear in mind your legal and regulatory obligations, what you need to do to aim to achieve compliance. And as Ben talked about earlier, that may vary depending on the size of the scheme. You'll also want to bear in mind your available resources. So I've just touched upon the fact that different schemes may have different resources available, whether that's the sponsor's IT team or you may need to rely on external help. You'll need to factor in those available resources in deciding the steps that you're going to take. And you'll also want to bear in mind your appetite for risk and actually what you want to do, what you can address in that context. And this is also a good place to talk about some scheme-specific aspects, which Grant is going to talk about.
Thanks, Helen. I think your earlier point about a multi-employer scheme will have far greater data flows between different sponsors in the scheme, and might also have diverging standards and approaches to data protection and cybersecurity within each of the sponsors. So that's harder in the circumstances for a trustee, that whilst in theory you've got a plan and a policy, then trying to join all those dots to keep it a consistent approach where there are so many stakeholders following their own policies. Now, whether a board embraces cyber risk mitigation with a capital C or a small c, if I've got that the right way around there on the screen, depends on its budgets and circumstances. But in all cases, it's essential to carry out some form of cybersecurity risk assessment. Everyone's short of time, we've got competing priorities, but we'll spend far more time and cost dealing with the aftermath of a cyber attack than spending a little of both time and cost upfront. So then it comes to Helen's point on available resources. It really is about maximising the resources available. So have your sponsors got their own plans and support in-house that can help? Have your third-party advisors and providers got cybersecurity plans in place and independent assessments that have tested those plans? And do your third-party advisors have templates on cybersecurity policies so that if you're budget constrained, you can lift off the shelf and start from there?
So we've talked about understanding the threat. We've talked about assessing that threat, and in the next slides I want to come on to now more detail about controls and mitigating that threat. Now I've got two slides on this. This first one is about governance and the documents and the other processes that act as controls, and then I'm going to come on to more technical and practical measures. But the first point on this one is then one of management and governance. It's really important to have structures, policies and procedures in place, setting out how the cybersecurity risk will be controlled and capturing those outcomes. So there should be a cybersecurity policy. There will also need to be documentation that captures the roles, the key people involved, their responsibilities and the decisions that they will take in respect of cybersecurity. And there will also want to be captured, maintained, and retains that risk assessment that we've already talked about in the previous slides. And there also should be a record of the assets that the scheme has and what you're doing to protect those. So that's the management and governance aspects. You should also, as we've touched on earlier, be looking at your supply chain, because third parties can add or carry cyber risk for you, and this is particularly an area of focus not just within pension schemes but all organisations at the moment, because there's an awareness, including at government level, that we've got a limited number of sort of key players in supply chains who are really carrying a significant amount of cyber risk for all of their customers. So what you want to do is you want to review your contracts with third-party suppliers. You want to look around what obligations they have, what audit rights you might have, and what recourse you might have if something potentially goes wrong.
And Helen, just to pull out the risk assessment there, perhaps with an example. So I spoke earlier about the increasing risk with short notice collateral calls. So in those cases, having a moving money protocol in place is key from a risk cyber perspective, to check as an additional step that the request is genuine and money is going to the right place. So for example, and it sounds into the detail, but really important, you know, the bank account, the sort code and the account number, does that match the trustee's records that you've seen before, so that it's verified and someone's not intercepted that email or instruction in the post? And has it been confirmed via a callback with the investment manager or consultant? That's really what happens when policies meet practice. Much of the hard work has probably and hopefully already been done by others that look at this. So leverage that and spend the time thinking about your scheme specifics and where any gaps might be. For example, the flow of information around trustees to and from the company.
So let's now talk through some of those practical and technical controls that you may potentially put in place. So the first one we've got on the slide is around limiting network access and identity controls. It may not be necessary for all users to have access to the member data or certain parts of your systems, and you should look to ensure that access is limited on a need-to-know basis. The next item is data security. So limiting, again, the sharing of data, limiting the data that you hold to what is necessary. And where possible, avoiding the use of personal devices and the use of personal email addresses within the scheme, which may add additional risk and additional systems into this overall framework of IT systems, which are making up those that you rely upon. Then we've got system security, and your IT experts will be in a position to assist you with this by identifying the necessary firewalls and antivirus software and any other programs which should be implemented in order to close vulnerabilities in the system. And then we've got resilience preparation. Now, in the event that you do have a cyber attack and an attacker encrypts or erases data, it's really important that you've got a backup available and that backup is recent and useful. You also need to ensure that everyone, including the IT team, your non-technical employees and anyone that would be involved in incident response, knows what they're responsible for and what they should be doing in the event of a data breach or attack. So that's the document very often referred to as sort of capturing all of that information as an incident response plan, and you should have one of those, as well as a business continuity plan which details the strategy as to how to keep the scheme business going in the event of an attack. And the last item on the slide in terms of resilience preparation is cyber liability insurance. So a specialist policy, depending on the terms, may provide sort of a range of things in the event of a cyber attack. It may potentially cover your losses, but it may also help you with third-party specialists who will come in and help you in the event of a cyber attack, which is also an important benefit for insureds that they often look to. So consider cyber liability insurance if you haven't got some in place. And then the final item, awareness and training. So Grant did touch on training earlier, the importance of having training and also keeping that training up to date and rolling it out again. If anyone has reported a data breach to the ICO, you'll know that one of the questions that's asked is whether the staff member involved had data protection training in the last 2 years. And obviously, it's important and highly desirable to be able to answer yes to that question and to move on to other issues.
I agree, Helen. Having had to report data breaches that I've seen across some of my schemes with advisors in the past, that's where you want all your ducks in a row in terms of the governance and the steps you've taken. Because as Ben said, it does happen, but it's actually what was done as what the mitigation processes in place and putting it right going forward. So what does good look like in these areas from a trustee perspective? Well, doing all of the above that Helen's described. I guess I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's true. As trustees, really, we need to seek help in those areas from others. And at the very least, we need to have worked through each area, understood what's in place and the shortfalls, and made a conscious decision whether to tackle the shortfalls, and if not, why not? A quick reminder about purpose limitation. One of the best controls that we could have in place as trustees and advisors is not to share data in the first place. So ask the question, does the recipient really need to know what you're planning to send them? And it's really important for us as trustees to limit the flow of data. I find as a trustee, when people are trying to be helpful, all sorts of data flows backwards and forwards on an email, on an individual or on a group basis to my co-board, my co-trustees. It's a good discipline to spot data when it comes in and consider when it's necessary, as that can lead to changing the processes. And so to give an example, sometimes you might see data being shared and just going, actually, that shouldn't be shared, or we don't need to see that, deleting emails with the data on, or responding to emails, taking out the email trail below and removing the attachment, really all leads to refining and limiting processes as a result. The fewer people that have the data, the better in terms of risk mitigation and cyber protection. And I think two key areas that Helen's mentioned there where trustee boards achieve either good or great in this area are around the resilience preparation and the training. As Ben mentioned earlier, the most likely risk and cause is human error. So training and frequent reminders of training, as Helen said, really important.
So we've talked about the controls and the mitigations that you should put in place to combat the cyber threat. The next pillar is monitoring the threat, and this is really important in terms of ongoing vigilance, and also because this threat is sort of constantly evolving over time. So internally, you want to be clear where is monitoring happening, how is monitoring happening, and who is responsible for that. And again, this can potentially be captured in the documentation we've talked about earlier. You'll also want to be doing monitoring externally, so looking for information on threats, on vulnerabilities, what's happening in the market, in the sector, what experiences are others happening. Also looking at other potential sources of external threat. So again, we've talked about the supply chain, your suppliers, and carrying out audits to make sure that they are doing what they committed that they would do in contracts, and not increasing the threat that you may face. Internally, again, recommended to carry out testing or dry runs of your cyber incident policy, what would happen in the event of an incident, and to having carried out those testing or dry runs, to really look at what lessons can be learned from actually trying to carry out that plan in practice. And a key thing there is, as much as possible, try and involve third parties who perhaps haven't put the document together, so you don't get into a position where effectively you're marking your own homework. Try and expect, or deal with, I should say, the unexpected.
So how as a trustee do we test our policies and cyber resilience? At Ross Trustees, we see there as being 8 focus areas. There's the policy itself, the cyber map or assessment, the third-party assessment, specialist support, liaising with the sponsoring employer, testing and maintenance, as Helen says, trustee indemnity insurance, and training. Few as the actuary, I did count 8 there, good. But appreciate that's a lot to take in a training session in itself, what Helen and I cover on this slide. But what I'd like to bring out from personal experience is wargaming. There's incredible value with trustee boards, sponsors and advisors taking the time to test what would happen and how quickly we could move in the event of a cyber incident. And of course, we've got many across the industry who are on hand to help with such exercises. This can be at a trustee meeting, a session which starts something like, there's been a cyber attack on X provider, which potentially affects the pension scheme. And then you grab that policy, bring it to life, and what you do. And that often flushes out some matters that don't work as well. Again, the approach taken will be scheme specific and depend upon the board. I'm seeing the requirement to address cybersecurity translate into different approaches for different schemes. It's typically the larger ones with time, resource, and budgets are already complying with the requirements. They've got a policy in place, they've war-gamed, but for others are working towards all doing so, at least by the time the requirement comes in, we hope, as a minimum to have a cyber policy in place. It's recognising it's more challenging for the smaller, less well-funded schemes without the budget and resource, and for those where there are other urgent priorities around funding, investment, and covenant. But those schemes do still need a cyber policy in place to protect members, sponsors, assets, and payments being made to our members. So I'll say it again, test your policies and plans as things will come out of the woodwork. One that Ben and I tested, how do you get hold of the right person within the sponsor who's based overseas to have a conversation on a Friday evening about a cyber incident? So really think about the most potentially damaging scenario to the scheme as well. So if we take a moment to picture who's the most involved person on our pension scheme, is that the secretary to the trustee, the pensions manager, the chair of trustee in the day-to-day running of the scheme? If you picture them for a minute, what if they suffer that cyber attack? It's worth working through that scenario to really test the policy.
Thanks, Grant. I think it was really helpful in bringing out some of those points, particularly on the testing and dry runs and learning those lessons that I touched upon. So we've talked about monitoring. Now the next pillar, we're going to look at minimising and responding to a cyber attack. Now, cyber attacks usually sophisticated, or in many cases sophisticated, and can be difficult to identify. And depending on the protections and the controls that you've got in place, it may nevertheless be some time before you realise that something is actually wrong. However, there's some red flags that it can be useful to look out for in the event that you've been compromised, and may help you to spot something that's wrong sooner. So we've got those on this particular slide. So you may find that your computer or your other devices are running extremely slowly or failing to load software or even start up in good time. If that's unusual, then that could be a sign of a hacker tool like a Trojan worm or some other ransomware having infected your system. If you or your colleagues can't log in despite using the correct user credentials, then again that may be an indication that an attacker has tampered in some way with your system. You should look out for emails which you would not usually expect to see, like password reset emails or containing links to third-party websites, which you should of course refrain from opening. And those sorts of phishing emails are often also the subject of something that you could test for with the help of IT experts in terms of rolling out sort of emails through your systems and checking that people aren't clicking on them. But if you are getting those links, it's always important to report it to someone and see if they are actually something that a hacker is trying to access your systems. If you find a piece of software inexplicably unavailable or is crashing, updating, or running extremely slowly, then again this could be a sign of an indication that an attacker has taken control of your systems. Similarly, new or unauthorized software installations, resets, or shutdowns in circumstances where there's no legitimate explanation, that may also be an indication that an attacker is operating your system remotely or is installing a hacker tool. Whether it's a custodian of assets or data or any third-party advisor tells you that they have suffered a cyber attack, then depending on the nature of the attack and your relationship of the third party, then there is a risk that the attacker has also impacted on your systems as well. But either way, you'll want to respond extremely quickly to that and involve the right people to make sure that you're protected and that you're taking all steps to respond to the threat to the third party as well. Sometimes hackers will also try and conduct test attacks on your systems to try and identify vulnerabilities. Even if your IT team are able to fend off that smaller attack, it may be, or it is important to be extra vigilant for something larger following, because that small attack may just be the precursor to something else. And finally, notifications from attackers will also, if one comes through, is obviously an indicator that you've been compromised, and you'll want to respond to that. And very often, notifications from attackers are accompanied by demands for ransom payments, and you'll want to take advice on that. But in all of these things, the absolute key is to respond quickly as soon as something like this is spotted, and to also make sure that anyone who does experience one of these things knows exactly who they need to contact in that situation, and that should be captured in the incident response plan and rolled out in terms of the training that we've talked about, so that everyone has got at their fingertips what they need to do, without potentially having to rely on the documentation, because that could be on a compromised system.
I agree, Helen, particularly that point about being able to act quickly. It's not a problem you can ignore when it arises. It's about how you deal with it and how quickly on the cyber attack. So just 3 points just to pull out here that Helen's built on. Really, it's about having to help with this IT assistance. We'll come on to communications later, but you can have draft communication templates ready to go. And really, for me as the chair of trustee, it's engaging with your legal advisor. So having them on the cybersecurity policy, as it's likely you'll need their help, particularly if the cybersecurity attack is one of your advisors.
So minimising a cyber attack, the final pillar, and we talked about moving quickly, and Grant has helpfully sort of started to touch on some of these that I've got on the slide in terms of getting IT assistance, engaging with legal and potential notifications. But there's a few others which I'll just touch on in a bit more detail. So we've talked about putting or having plans in place, the incident response plan. Really important to put that plan into action from an audit trail perspective, and also to maximise all the effort that you've put into having that plan. You want to make use of that plan, and if somebody comes along afterwards and sort of looks at your response, then it obviously looks more credible to have actually followed the plan that you thought was a good idea to put in place beforehand. At the fourth point, contacting your cyber insurer. So this is one to bear in mind and not get lost when you're dealing with the immediate aftermath of an incident. The policy will usually provide contact details in terms of making a notification, and insurers are likely to want information in terms of what's happened and what's gone on. But the key thing here, from a sort of maximising the pension scheme's position, is to make sure that you comply with any notification requirements, so you don't lose the opportunity to rely on your cyber insurance down the line, and also that you're properly engaging with the cyber insurer in terms of making any big decisions in terms of what you might tell affected individuals or what you might tell third parties about what's happened, because the insurer may also have a view on that in terms of if they're then going to pay out on any consequences that might follow from those big decisions. So fifth point, your legal team will be able to help you with advice in terms of notifications, whether that's to the regulator, either in terms of data protection or the pension regulator, what you might say to affected members, whether you should tell the police or other third parties, such as the NCSC. So those are the notifications that you'll want to consider. You may also need further IT help at this stage to investigate what's gone on and to help you restore corrupted or encrypted files, as Grant's touched on. That's really important. In any incident, obviously would wish that incident hasn't happened, but there will always be lessons to be learned from any incident. So that's an important point to bear in mind at the end, is that if you do go through an incident, think about what you've learned, what you would take into account next time, and how you might change your policies and documents as a consequence.
So Helen and Ben, perhaps a thought from me to leave our audience with. So for me as a trustee, it's important that committing some time to spend on this and some budget. You'll spend far more time and cost dealing with the aftermath of a cybersecurity than we will spending a little more time and money up front. So I think it is time well spent, particularly as cyber risk becomes increasingly up the risk agenda.
Thank you, Grant. So that's really important. I just had one closing thought, which I just wanted to add in terms of what I was talking about in terms of dealing with an incident. And that's just to bear in mind that, again, you'll be taking actions quickly. You might be creating documentation. It's important to bear in mind at that stage that documentation that you could be creating could be disclosable in a piece of litigation, or it could be disclosable to the regulator. So what you should be doing is where you're creating those internal documents for your own records, making sure they're factual and not where possible, and avoid drawing any sort of conclusions or admitting fault in the first instance. But finally, I just wanted to round up with some thoughts based on everything Ben, Grant and I have covered in terms of what you can do after today's session. And we have, I think the first thing to acknowledge is we have covered a lot in that time. And this is not something, as will be apparent in what we've just discussed, that can really be dealt with by one person in isolation. It does require the help of IT. It might require the help of sponsor and other third parties. But what we've tried to encapsulate here is some things that we think are ones to focus on, really, in terms of after today's session. It might be overstating it to call them quick wins, but things that you can nevertheless make progress on. So the first item we've got is updating the risk register in terms of that risk assessment, and potentially also looking at assessing your own position as well, including cyber risk in the single code compliance projects, considering your own personal IT setup. So as I've touched upon, considerable IT help may be required, or at least useful, in terms of looking at the scheme's overall position. But as a starting point, you can look at your own personal IT setup, because actually getting any issues that you might obviously experience personally would obviously be an issue for the scheme overall, and also an issue for you, so one to avoid. Thinking about those third-party providers. So if you haven't already, issuing questionnaires to them in terms of what cybersecurity measures they've got in place and when the responses come in, considering those in due course. Looking at whether you've got an incident response plan. If not, adopting one, or looking back at what you've already got in place and considering whether it should be updated. And then the last item I've got there is considering insurance. Now, in the context of this session, what I've talked about is obviously insurance for the scheme and the potential advantages to the scheme and having insurance in place, but you might also want to consider your own position in the first instance as well.
Okay, thanks very much to Helen and Grant, and we've stuck fantastically well to time. I think that's your influence, Grant. It usually happens when you're on a call. So I'm pleased to say that we have some questions from our audience. So thank you all very much for your engagement so far, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. I'll give the other panelists who've been doing a lot of work over the last half an hour a chance to have a quick look at those questions. And I'll take the first one from an anonymous attendee. So the question is, as consultants, how can we help pensioner trustees who have Gmail, Hotmail addresses to protect themselves and their devices from a cyber attack? So I think this is a really helpful and really practical question, because the reality for a lot of our clients is that we do have pensioner trustees, or just trustees generally, who have non-company email addresses. So they don't work for the sponsor anymore. They don't have company.com email addresses. I think it goes back to the training point first and foremost. So understanding the importance of having protections in place, understanding the importance of doing things like updating your firewalls, updating your antivirus software, taking those easy wins, those simple things that you can do to improve the security of your home computers and email addresses. But it also goes to the point that Grant was talking about earlier about purpose limitation and making sure we're only sharing the data that's absolutely necessary. And we can always take additional steps to further protect that document if it has to go to a Gmail, Hotmail account. That's not specific to those email addresses. They're just not company email addresses. That's what we're talking about here. And so using things like password protected documents, even something as sophisticated as two-factor authentication so that somebody can access a document, and then taking the data that's within that document and doing our best to minimize it. So that might involve something like pseudonymization, so making sure that it's harder to trace who the person is that we're talking about, using member numbers, things like that. So making the jigsaw harder to put together for somebody who might access the document. So thank you very much for that question from our anonymous attendee there. I've got a question here, which I think is probably well suited to Helen, which is, how does Gowling assist a client affected in multiple jurisdictions by a cybersecurity incident? So thank you, Maria, for that question. And Helen, can I pass over to you?
Of course. So this is not uncommon that a cybersecurity incident can potentially affect a client in multiple jurisdictions, because, as we know, cyber criminals don't treat country boundaries or jurisdictional boundaries with any importance whatsoever, and are also just keen to target as much data as they can, and that data may be relating to individuals that may be resident in different jurisdictions. So not an uncommon issue. The first point is really to understand actually which jurisdictions are potentially relevant, though, and not simply to go out and get advice from every single jurisdiction that may be relevant, because that may be overkill in the circumstances. So some initial advice, but then depending on the jurisdictions involved, I've been part of a number of global teams internally with some of our other international offices where we've helped a client respond to an incident, and that may have come from North America, and I'm providing advice on England and Wales, or equally I may have been the one going out and looking for advice from other offices, and equally if it's in a jurisdiction where we don't have a particular office, then we work with our best friends in those jurisdictions to put together a coordinated response. So that was a long answer to saying we do and we can.
That's great. Thanks very much, Helen. A question which I think maybe Grant will be well placed to have a look at, but feel free to throw it back towards me, Grant, if you would like. So a question from Khaled: what input should there be from the sponsors to the trustees?
And really encouraged by that question as trustee with sponsor involvement. And as with everything, really, collaboration is key. So working alongside the sponsor, and really helpful to understand from the sponsor who the person is on the ground to help us understand the IT and the data flow between the trustees and company, but also who the person is on the ground to go and get involved in that incident response plan as and when it happens. So I think that is key. And then obviously, if there is a cyber event and it relates to a pension scheme and the pension scheme has got the sponsor's name in it, then of course there is a reputational issue as well. So I think that's why it's key to have someone from the sponsor who handles media and communications in that incident response plan at some point to cover that off. And so I think 2 requests from the sponsor really would be, let us know who your contact is and let us know if your contact changes. It's no good us having a contact and then they've moved on elsewhere or no longer involved. And let us know if you have a cyber breach as well, even if it's a suspected one. So again, the trustees can start to do preparation with regards to the data. So those are some thoughts from me, Ben.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Grant. I think it's a classic risk situation, isn't it? Which is that you're only as strong as your weakest link, and if the trustee processes aren't strong, then that is a direct concern of the sponsor, because ultimately the sponsor is the funder of last resort for the pension scheme. So collaboration and working together is really important, because it's in everybody's best interests there. I've got a question here from Giles. Thanks for the question, Giles. This is about pensions dashboards, so something that I covered off on one of the very first slides. Will there be new risks relating to cyber from pensions dashboards, and if so, what are they? I think the answer to that really, Giles, is that it is an exacerbation of an existing risk. It is an increase to an existing risk. the cyber threat of sharing information with dashboards, it is, I suppose, that the risk of individuals accessing their data or accessing data that doesn't belong to them, actually, that relates to all of their pension information. So what the dashboards are is they will just be a way of you seeing all of your pensions in lots of different schemes, and indeed eventually your state pension as well. So if you are able to glean enough personal data about somebody to get hold of their records or their national insurance number or something like that, that there is a greater risk of somebody pretending to be one of your members, pretending to access their benefits. And that is really, I think, the central cybersecurity risk that we're talking about there. I don't know, Grant, I know you've got some schemes who are looking at dashboards, whether you've got any thoughts about the sort of increase in risk there.
I think, again, it's just working through those policies and procedures, and on that cyber map assessment I talked about, there's clearly more data that's flowing around now into different people. So again, understanding the protections going out and beyond. But I agree, I think there are new risks coming, and we don't know them yet, do we, until we work through the detail and see the dashboard live. So being abreast of those as trustees, linking with our advisors on what it means, really.
That's great. Thanks very much, Grant. Just a question from me, so I won't be anonymous. I'll just ask my question. So from your experience of dealing with schemes that have suffered a cyber attack, if there was one lesson that you could sort of get a time machine, go back in time and to tell the trustees who haven't yet suffered an attack, what would that lesson be?
So I think for me, Ben, really it is just make sure the time is spent understanding where the potential weaknesses are and mitigate as best you can against those. So in that particular scenario, that was it, actually. Had we have worked through in the detail, then we might have at least spotted some actions. Would it have prevented it? Probably not, but at least you'd feel comfortable that we knew where the weaknesses were and mitigated as best we could against those.
I think from my perspective, I think that's a really good example of an issue that I've seen come out of responding to an attack, wishing the plans had addressed something slightly different or had been tested, because actually when it came to it, they weren't perhaps as useful as was hoped. But I think the central thing I would say, because there are very, very many lessons, I could talk for much longer than the time we've got in terms of things that both I and clients have learned, but is that we wish it hadn't happened. It's a very painful experience. Not just spending time with me, but in terms of having to deal with the whole incident, the notifications, potentially the aftermath, the dealing with third parties. It really does take up a lot of time, effort, cost, resource, and therefore prevention is cure, and therefore investing up front and doing as much as you can to avoiding attack in the first place or mitigating the consequences, I think would be the central thing that probably every client that's been through that experience would say.
That's great. Thanks very much to you both. So we've got a couple of more practical questions here, one from Peter and an anonymous question, but along the same theme, which is, can we get hold of the slides or a recording of this session afterwards? So yes is the answer to that. The recording will be available to all attendees, and we can email around the slides as well. So pleased to hear that people are finding it useful. And obviously, as has been said there by Helen and Grant, we have covered a lot of ground today. And if you need to follow up with us at all by email, please do so. Please get in touch, because this is an area that we're all obviously focusing on, and we're happy to help with. So all that really remains is for me to say a massive thank you to our panelists. So thank you to Helen and to Grant, and to give you all 5 minutes back in your day by finishing on time, which I can see already by Grant's face has pleased him greatly. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.